Hi, Grade 12s. We are very close to the end. I hope you had an awesome grad week, and thank you to all of you that sent me pictures of what you've been up to this weekend with all of your graduation stuff with your family. So if you do want to send those to me, I'd love to see them. And if you're dressed up or if you just have something like a celebration, I'd love to see that. Okay, so I don't have any more school information for you this week. I think they're sending out information soon about textbook return because I'm pretty sure it's starting next Monday, but don't quote me on that. So we'll just get right into the Rack Your Brain. I want you to watch a crash course history. I know you missed John Green. I did. I missed showing you him. On the Cold War in Asia. So it kind of talks about Vietnam and stuff like that. I know we've already gone over Cold War, but it kind of gives like a good review of what happened in Vietnam. And then there's an article, or not an article, but looking at kind of the Black Lives Matter movement right now, which is obviously a huge part of the media right now. And so it's about a 2-3 minute clip of some of the protests. And then the street leading to the White House, the mayor of Washington, because the president of the United States, although he lives in Washington, doesn't control Washington. And so he renamed it Black Lives Matter Plaza, and they wrote like this huge thing on the street, and it's pretty cool. So watch the PowerPoint. There's a little bit of reading your textbook, not too much. I think it's only like 12 pages. And then those Unit 4 notes are still in a PDF on the Google Classroom. And then this article is not required. It's just an interesting article. So it's about kind of what's going on in America with police officers and some of the problems that we're seeing. So it's a good article, but you're not required to read it. There's not going to be a Teams meeting this week, but we'll meet next week for sure. But if you do need me for anything or like help with a project that you haven't completed or something like that, just message me and I can call you on Teams, or I can call you at home or something like that. Okay. The assessment for this week is called How Can You Be an Active Citizen? And it's not due until the following week. So you have lots of time to complete it. And then after this, really the only assessment I have for you is kind of like a review of remote learning. It's not even like, I'll probably do something on the course, but this, I need you to complete like kind of an assessment for me on how remote learning has gone, because although I won't be teaching you next year, just in case this happens again, I kind of want to know what works best for students. Okay. So if you could do that for me, but that won't get posted until probably the end of this week, probably Friday, just to spread things out a bit. So just use the time this week. You can hand that in that assignment as soon as you want, but I'm not having it due until the following week. Okay. Okay. So we'll go through the PowerPoint. You already have that PDF. Okay. So Unit 4, this is our last chapter. So the Orange Revolution. Oh, see, you can see I'm tired because I did not capitalize revolution, and it should be capitalized, children. So this is kind of old news for a lot of people, but it's still used in your textbook as an example of how ordinary citizens took action and then affected government change. And so Ukraine believed, and they were right, that the election in 2004 was corrupt, and the government was accused of basically stealing the election. And so these citizens took it upon themselves to enact this change and to basically request a second election. And they did so. And so that is that's kind of like a prime example of like a recent type example, although 2004 is really not that recent anymore, but they use it a lot in the textbook, if you remember it from grade 11 as well. Just kind of talking about how citizens initiate change. And right now, with the Black Lives Matter movement, that is also initiating change. And so it's a really good tie-in for current events right now, which super bums me out that we can't have this discussion in person. But I think I've said that every week. So I digress. Anti-apartheid movements were more examples of how citizens enacted change. So for under 300 years, the interaction of the Africans or the Blacks within South Africa and the European settlers or colonialists, the whites, created this legacy of violence, distrust, and hate in South Africa. Black people were treated as second-class or third-class citizens, and whites basically had all the luxuries and all the power and all the wealth. They were the only ones that could vote. They were the ones who ran the government. And so in the 1960s, more and more acts of civil disobedience occurred. Protest strikes, and the white government basically just imposed these harsh acts against them. And so, like, to give you an idea of what apartheid was like, so like there was 19 million Africans or blacks within South Africa. There's only 4.5 million whites. However, blacks only had 13% of the land, and whites had 87% of the land. The share of the national income, blacks had less than 20%, and whites held 75%. Doctors per person, 1 for 44,000 for blacks, 1 per 400 for whites. Infant mortality rate in the city, 20%. In the rural area, 40%. Whites, 2.7%. Annual expenditure on education per student, $45 US, compared to $696 US. And look at the teachers per student, 1 to 60, 1 to 22. So like this is circa 1978, but like the discrepancy is huge. And whites were in the minority, but they held all the control and all the power and everything like that. And so more and more liberation movements started to spring up. And Nelson Mandela led this. He was president of the African National Congress, the ANC, and its goal was to protect Black Africans. And eventually they did resort to some violence. Now, another organization split from this, and they were called the Pan-Africanist Congress. Now, they didn't focus specifically on Blacks, but basically any non-white group. So anybody that was not in that minority that controlled the government. Now, eventually there was, like I said, there was violence. The world started to impose sanctions. They tried to isolate the nation to kind of try and make them deal with it. And by the late 1980s, it became very obvious that apartheid had failed because, it's wrong. Now, Mandela actually spent 30 years in prison. And so he was freed from prison in 1993, I think, maybe 1992. And then in 1994, in the very first free interracial election where whites and blacks could vote, Mandela became the first Black president of South Africa. And he just died, actually, the day after my son was born. He died, or the day my son was born, but Ben. So he died in 2013, in December. So after apartheid had been abolished, they established a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which it is obviously similar to what we had or have within Canada for Indigenous people. And it was basically to help deal with a lot of the issues of the past because, although apartheid was ended, there was still so much hatred and anger and frustration and so many wrongs that had to be righted. And so they I don't know. And so they basically needed to look at, okay, how can we even attempt to fix this? Okay. And it's obviously still not perfect within South Africa, just like it's still not perfect, obviously within the United States or in Canada, right? So the war in Vietnam is another example of this. So we've talked about Vietnam before, but there was an anti-war movement developed against this war. And by 1968, there was over 500,000 US troops in Vietnam. And about 3 million, it's right there, 3 million served in Vietnam over the total war. But there was a ton of anti-war movements. So we've already talked about draft dodgers, but low-income Americans and African Americans were disproportionately represented amongst the draftees. And a lot of it was because there was a ton of exceptions made for white males who were in university, but a lot of people couldn't afford to go to university unless you were like an elite. And so there were some exceptions for avoiding the draft, but basically you could not avoid service if you had been drafted. And so in many cases, a lot of the white male population of the United States just avoided the draft entirely and never had to worry about getting drafted, especially like richer men. And whereas a lot of the lower income, which unfortunately was often minorities, they couldn't avoid the draft. And then they got drafted and then they got sent to Vietnam. Excuse me. And so the war was not popular in America. A large part of that was probably because media was a lot more prevalent, more people had televisions. And so you could actually see what war looked like. And so a lot of people are like, maybe we shouldn't be here. And so it really changed the public perception of the war. And November 15th, 1969, they had the largest peace march in U.S. history, which if you've ever seen Forrest Gump, this is the protest. And by 1976, the war was over, but it did nothing worked. So it was all kind of for naught. Vietnam was united as one communist country. So that war, all those men that died, really for no reason from the United States. So leading for change, when we talk about change and what we can do, a lot of times the people who make the biggest change can sometimes be obviously influential people within our society. So that could be athletes, or it could be political activists, or it can be musicians. You might not know who the Dixie Chicks are, but this is the Dixie Chicks. And so one of the big things that happened with them is at a concert in the UK, they're from Texas, and at a concert in the UK, they said publicly that like they're ashamed that George Bush Jr. was from Texas, that he was the president at the time. And it was like this huge thing, and people are like, I'm gonna never listen to your music again. And radio stations like refused to listen to their music. So they had support, obviously, but they also had lots of people who were like, they just completely trashed them. Now, Martin Luther King Jr., for example, huge activist, obviously probably the biggest activist for civil rights in the 1960s in America, and he was shot and killed. Okay, and then this is why can't I remember his name right now? It's in the textbook. Hold that thought. I went backwards. Oh no! Oh no! Where are we? Sorry, guys. I can't find it. I know it was in the textbook. Anyway, so I can't remember their names, and I apologize, but they were at the Olympics, and obviously two black men won, and I can't remember what race it was either. But they were basically, because they were considered lower class citizens, it was like an embarrassment to some of the people that they had won, especially for the United States. And so they hold their fists up in like a symbol of like Black power. And their gloves, incidentally, actually came from this guy who I also can't remember his name, but I'm pretty sure he's Australian. And he had these gloves, and he gave them the gloves because they wanted to like really have an influence, like imagery of that Black power kind of fist in the air. And I believe they got in trouble for it because you're not supposed to show political activism at the Olympics, which is ridiculous. But like when I was at the Olympics in London, somebody like unfurled a banner at the event we were at, and I can't remember what it was, but it was like right behind the medal thing. I took a picture of it, but it basically it was a political activist thing of something that was going on in the UK at the time. And like they got in huge trouble. They got kicked out. Like the banner got ripped up and everything because you can't show like any political activism at the Olympics. But I believe the guy who won gold, I think he won 2 races actually. So we also have to look at what are consequences when individuals or leaders don't act. So like Hitler and like appeasement in before World War II, or like poverty and like Rwanda and things like that. So when people don't act, really bad things can happen. And so it's important that we do promote active citizenship. And so 5 ways that we can promote active citizenship is to take part, to get involved, to question things like why is that the way it is and why is that the law and things like that. I'm not saying disobey the law, but I'm saying like it's okay and it's important to look at these different things. Include everybody. This is also a very important thing. Insist on accurate information. Always check your information. Look at different sources. Look at different media biases, and focus on the land and the people around us. Because, especially within Canada, we have a huge impact on our land and kind of where we came from. Okay, I already talked about this. There's no Teams meeting this week. And so, yeah, the assignment this week is how can you be an active citizen? It's a reflective piece. It's got some information that I want you to look at about why should we get involved and what should we do and things like that. And you can bring in current events. You can bring in personal experience, things like that. Okay. If you have any questions on previous or missing assignments, please let me know now because we are nearing the end and I will not be able to do marking in July, nor do I want to. So I really want you to get that information into me as soon as possible, all of those assignments. Your marks should be finalized that last week before the 26th. So I need you to have it in. Okay, because I have to send those marks to Alberta Ed. So that's that. And I hope you had a happy grad week and I will talk to you soon. Bye, guys.